I guess I can project even without the microphones, but thank you for having me. I know I was kind of on the fence about coming, but then I got promised a free lunch, and as you might know, we don't make very much in the legislature, but we do. It is basically all you can eat. So that's what got me here today. And I can say too is from someone who is I think in a thankless job. I thank you guys. I think you probably also don't get too many thank you cards in the press for the work that you do, but I can tell you that I at least appreciate it, and I think many of my colleagues in the legislature appreciate it very much. I read the coverage all the time, and even if I don't agree with you, I like being able to see different points of view. So thank you for that. Now, on the income tax, I think some people are like me. Maybe you're tired of hearing about it. It's been kind of in the news a lot recently. At the same time, it's a very important topic, and so I have spent. It's not a new thing for me. I spent, in 2019 when I was elected, my very first thing I did as soon as I was elected was that I wrote an op-ed about, I think it's time for us to get rid of the income tax. It was like December 2019, and at that time, there was a lot of, the response was basically like, there's no way, this is not a thing, it can't happen. And I would tell you that just over the last couple of years, I've seen the development go from almost this will never happen to all of our surrounding states are kind of moving in that direction. There's serious conversations being done in Mississippi and Arkansas. And at the end of the day, this is something that I think we really need to consider more carefully. That's why I brought the study resolution in the last session to have really a close examination of these issues and give us an opportunity to kind of flesh out a lot of the issues that we have. We have very complicated tax code and things we need to change. And so we're having this series of meetings in the House Ways and Means Committee, or at least a subcommittee of it now, to examine some of these things, and I think it'll give us an opportunity to look at this going forward. Now, first I'd like to start off and say, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Most people don't care about taxes all that much. It usually puts you to sleep. I can tell you in law school, income tax was probably the least interesting class that anybody had. My dad actually, ironically, was an IRS agent. That's what he was his whole career. So I have a special place in my heart for the income tax. But at the end of the day, we really have to look at it from a standpoint of what is the impact on the people of Louisiana. That is really what matters. Now, if Louisiana was just average, if we were just average in the country, we would all live 4 years longer and get a 33% raise. And the crazy thing is if you drive across the border into Texas, you basically become average, you get that back. You get 3.5 years of your life and about a 33% raise if you drive across the border into Texas. Now, if you look at it from a census perspective, in the last 10 years, Texas grew 6 times faster than Louisiana, and the rest of the country grew 3 times faster than Louisiana. The last time Louisiana added a congressional seat was 1910, over 100 years ago. So that was the last time Louisiana actually grew faster than the rest of the country. So what we're seeing is this is a problem that's been around for a long time. This is the structural thing that we have not been able to climb out of. We lost the 8th congressional district in 1990. We lost the 7th congressional district in 2010, and we're on deck to lose the 6th congressional district in 2030 if we don't do anything to change the population trends. So that's really what's at stake for us. It's really the future of our state, and it's really something that requires bold action if we want to change it. We really have to do something big, and getting rid of the income tax is admittedly big. So how do we get here? I think that when I started to look at this problem, I said, well, how do we get here in order to find out, well, what's the answer? How do we get it? Well, starting with the fact that we haven't gained a congressional seat in 1910 shows that this is a long-standing problem. Whatever's going wrong in Louisiana has been around for a very long time. And so what happened in the 1930s was Huey Long became governor. You guys might have heard of him. And what he did is he set up a system that is very dependent on Baton Rouge. He said, if you ever want anything done, if you're a local government, if you're a business, if you're anyone, you have to come to Baton Rouge, and you're going to have to kiss the ring. That was the system that's set up by Huey Long in the 30s and his cronies after that. And since then, we haven't been able to climb out of that legacy. It's still around. It's still with us today. Now, we've modified it. We've tweaked it. We've done our best to kind of nibble around the edges, but we've never been able to fully get out of that shadow. And a lot of the problems that we have now, honestly, the income tax, a lot of the major deductions that are used today that really kind of starve local governments for revenue, they all kind of came out of that Huey Long era, and they've just been exacerbated in the time since. So Louisiana was built on a system where we're trying to basically use our mineral wealth and some of our other natural advantages to basically band-aid over a broken tax system that's existed for, like I said, over 100 years. And so when we're looking at how are we going to fix it, you really have to fundamentally throw out the, you kind of have to throw out the old model. You have to fundamentally change it. I joke it's kind of like a Jenga puzzle, Every time in the legislature, and it's gone on forever, as long as any of us can remember, we always try to fix one bad piece. There's one bad thing that's wrong. We're going to fix the homestead exemption. We're going to fix ITEP. We're going to fix with this and that. And every time you try and pull out the inventory tax, is a popular thing because it's just such a terrible system. The inventory tax is basically just a pass-through where via businesses, state government funds local government because they don't have any money. And so every time we try and fix one of these pieces, it's kind of like that Jenga puzzle. You try to pull out that one piece and the whole thing falls down. And so really it requires this fundamental look on what is wrong, how do we fix it, how do we structure government in order to fix it. And it's all started way back there with Huey Long, and that's what we're trying to undo. And so it's not simply, when I say, hey, I want to get rid of the income tax, it's not simply a, hey, look, we're just going to cut everybody's taxes by $4 billion. That's not going to happen. One, it's not plausible, it's not responsible, and that's really not what I'm advocating for. What you're looking at is trying to restructure government, and I think the best places to look are these neighboring states who are very successful at attracting new people, have been very successful in growing their, like I said, the life expectancy, the median income levels of the families there, like Texas and Florida, which are right next door. So this brings us to the point of how can we fix it? How can we fix it? I was having a discussion earlier, and I had this discussion often, about, it would be awesome if you just made somebody emperor for the day and they could just go through and eliminate all these bad policies that we have in Louisiana. If we just went through and we eliminated, we said, listen, the homestead exemption, it's very popular, but at the end of the day, it really starves local governments for money. They can't pay their police, they can't pave their roads, they can't fix their schools, they can't do anything because they have this homestead exemption that in some parishes up to 75% of the property pays no tax at all, no property tax. And so we could say fundamentally it's bad policy. We could say ITEP, this is a huge giveaway to major corporations that would probably be here anyway. I mean, there's thousands of pages written on this, and it'd be great if you could just go and you eliminate the bad things, but in reality, it's just not possible. It's been tried a million times and it's failed every time. So I think what you have to look at is a balance. If you look at it as getting rid of the income tax, now you're actually getting something for trying to address some of these historical broken policies. And that's really the whole thought behind this. Is it's really just a transfer of saying how are we going to fix what's broken here, and how can we get it in a way that I think is politically viable that can actually pass. And that's why getting rid of the income tax, I think, is a great way, one, of fixing the competitive disadvantage that we're at with Texas. I mean, their tax loads are about the same, but at the end of the day, because the sticker price on Texas is zero, essentially. For someone moving to Texas, their sticker price is zero, even if they get it made up in the end with property taxes. For us in Louisiana, the sticker price is 4.25%. If you're a corporation, it's 7.5%. And these are things that just drive these successful companies and people away. And so, if you look at how we can move that forward, how we can make it more competitive, it really requires something that's going to make us competitive with that. At the same time, shifting that revenue and raising that money and spending that money locally is the way that you can move to a system that's more efficient at serving the needs of the people, and also it's more accountable. That same dollar, say it's revenue neutral, but that same dollar that's raised, whether it's raised and you send it to Baton Rouge, and then chances are it's going to go through a committee or two, it's going to get cut up depending on who's the chairman and who's the governor and everything else. By the time you get your dollar back, it might be 50 cents once it goes through the roulette wheel of state government. But if you raise that locally, I don't have to ask. I'm from Mandeville. You don't have to ask Shreveport to pay for your road in Mandeville or pay for your new city hall. And it's the same way. New Orleans doesn't have to go and ask Lake Charles to come pave their road, which is essentially what happens when we centralize all the spending and power in Baton Rouge. And so undoing that system, and then we can undo that system, make the taxes more effective and more accountable to the local population who gets to vote on what their property taxes are, who gets to vote on who's spending their property taxes. You don't have a lot of influence on a state level, but you have much more on a local level. And so you can really solve those two problems at the same time. You can make the state more competitive, and then you can also make the dollars more effective in raising them and spending them locally. I think that, like I said, the revenue neutral aspect of it is very important, because I think, sometimes I've seen it portrayed as like, oh, this is a tax cut, it's just going to be a tax cut. It's really not. I mean, really, we have to do it exact. You can argue about how much money we should spend. That's a different argument to saying, how should we raise that money effectively and competitively? And I think if you look at the plan that I brought in 2021, I think my friend Tyler Bridges at the Advocate, he described it as the bill that has something everyone can hate. And that was what it was. I mean, and honestly, that was a fair title. I think it did have something everyone can hate. It reduced the homestead exemption to be more in line like the states that don't have an income tax, like Texas and Florida. It essentially phased out ITEP. It said, hey, look, we spent $2.5 billion on ITEP every year. At the end of the day, we could use that. That more than half offsets the cost of the income tax. And so you have this, you have these giant exemptions that we give away that are not competitive, that aren't in line with what other states do. And so we can get rid of those and use that to offset a lot of the cost of the income tax, of getting rid of the income tax, even without necessarily burdening residents that much more. And so there's also other exemptions that I, kind of looked at. A lot of them are pretty technical, but at the end of the day, they cost the state a lot of money, or at least the local governments a lot of money. And so that's why the local governments are always having to go back, is because really they have no property tax base. That's one of the fundamental problems here in Louisiana, is the lack of a property tax base for local governments to depend on requires them to go into Baton Rouge and beg. And so I think if you look at it as a property tax offset some, also the state sales tax is relatively low. It's like about 4.45% now in Louisiana. In Texas, for example, it's like 6.25, and it's higher in other states. But what really makes that tax higher, why we have the highest sales tax in the country, is because of that local component. The local government's tax, they add taxes on top of that state component, and that's really what drives us up. And also, as the local component has it's not subject to the constitutional restrictions on food and everything. People will tell me, well, hey, the state's taxing me when I go into the grocery store. In reality, it's the locals that are really taxing them on those pieces they spend at the grocery store. And so I think if you really want to expand that property tax base, it gives you an opportunity to lower the local government sales tax component, which was also part of that bill that I passed in 21, or I brought in 2021. And I think that's an important piece too, is that you really have to look at a way to lower that sales tax and shift that burden to what it is in most other states where the property tax bears that burden. And I think finally the last thing that I usually get when I talk about this is this possible? Is this possible? I mean, at the end of the day, is this possible is probably the most question. I mean, lots of people agree with getting rid of the income tax, but then they say, hey, look, all these other things, they're all sacred cows. You can't touch a sacred cow in Louisiana. We're not going to do it. And I would say at the end of the day, anything is possible. Anything is possible. And we're at a point now, just talking to everyone, talking to my colleagues in the legislature, I think we all recognize we're kind of at a point in Louisiana's history where we have to do something big. We have the 0.45 sales taxes about to roll off. We have, basically significant fiscal wins coming when all these federal stimulus is gone, when all this hurricane money is gone. We're going to have to figure out some way to pay for everything. And so we can continue kicking the can down the road. We can continue to say, hey, well, maybe we'll renew a temporary sales tax. Maybe that'll buy us some time. But at the end of the day, we really have to look at reinventing at least the Louisiana wheel. We have to look at what these other states have done if we want to get out of this cycle of just kicking the can down the road. And so I think that attitude, I think, is pervasive in the state. I think lots of people, regardless of where I go to speak about this issue, they all look at it. They all know somebody that's moved to Texas. It's their son, it's their neighbor, it's something else. Everybody knows somebody that's moved to Texas or Florida, one of these other states that have seen such high, explosive growth in the last 10 years. And I think that people are realizing that it's time to do something big. It's time to do something, it's time to make a big change. And like I said, at the end of the day, it costs us, the bad government in Louisiana costs us about, 4 years of your life and a 33% raise. When you put it in terms of that to people, it really solidifies what a difference it makes. And honestly, even for me, it makes a big difference. When I didn't know that, I had to research those numbers. When you tell me it cost me 4 years of my life to be in Louisiana and 33% raise, that's a huge disparity that we have to address. And you're not going to be able to do that by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You're not going to be able to close that gap by, culture wars, the other stuff that gets all the media coverage up in Baton Rouge. You're going to have to make significant structural changes, and that's the only way we're going to fix the problem, and we're going to guarantee a better future for the state. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Some people I know already have some ready for me, and I appreciate your time. Except for from Will Sintel. He asked me too many questions. Anybody else?
Richard, can you give me an idea, kind of a 1, 2, 3, how you would replace the money and how much each of the replacement items would raise, just very generally speaking, if you got rid of the income tax?
Yeah. So this is based on the bill that I brought in 21, which is, of course, what we're studying now in the committee, right, to try and figure out the best way to do it. The first thing would be the income tax raises about $4.5 billion. It changes every year. It actually, because of the Trump tax cuts, it actually raised the income tax take, right? So if my job was to replace the state income tax, Trump made it harder, because when he cut the federal income tax and that deduction, it actually raised everybody's state taxes, and so now we take a little bit more. But just give and take, it's about $4.5 billion. There's some of that is offset when you look at, well, what are the current transfers from the state government to the local governments? And so the biggest one, of course, is the minimum foundation program, which funds K through 12 schools. Louisiana pays a significant amount from a state level for that. In my bill in 2021, what I did is said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to reduce that by a percentage, and then we're going to replace that amount and local property taxes. So it's really not cutting anything from schools. What it's doing is it's funding it through local property taxes instead. One of the major things in order to offset that growth in the property tax base is to phase out the ITEP program. So the ITEP program costs $2.5 billion a year. I would argue that it's really not necessary to attract most of the people that use it. And so getting rid of $2.5 billion, that really offsets a lot of the $4.5 billion or so of the total tax. The other thing that you have to look at is raising the state level of sales tax, and I think I raised it to about 6.1%, which is a little less than what Texas is, and then expanding the base of that to include delivery of the digital goods, as well as some of the make permanent some of the deductions or the exemptions that were eliminated in the 0.45 when they passed that 0.45 cents. So that would make up some of the revenue on the state level, but really the balance of it is going to be made up by property tax collections. And like I said, about half of that is probably going to come from that ITEP exemption. There's also nonprofits have a significant exemption, especially in things that are not. It's much more generous than what occurs in other states, and so that portion of it would also make up some part. Nobody actually can quantify what that is, though. I've asked everyone in the world that question of, hey, could you quantify how much revenue we forego in that nonprofit exemption, and it's pretty steep, but nobody knows. So I think that's the two major ones. The other thing would be the homestead exemption. So the homestead exemption raises about $800 million. In my bill in 2021, I cut it from $75,000 to $25,000, which is basically in line to what kind of Texas and Florida have. Texas is it's not that generous, and Florida is a little bit more. But the reasoning behind that is that like I said, there's parishes in the state that 75% of the property pays no property tax, and as a result, they really don't have a way to fund themselves. And so that's really a big impact for those areas where they really need to have a base of revenue in order to fund it, so they're not dependent on the state anymore for money.
Do you have an idea roughly how much the two property tax components would rate?
Yeah, so like I said, so the ITEP component would be $2.5 billion or $2.3 billion, something along that measure. I think that the homestead exemption would have been maybe, if you're cutting it by a third, it's like 800, so maybe 600 million, something like that. And then finally, the nonprofit exemption, I can't even tell you how much that would be worth. There's a few other minor ones too that probably added up to a miscellaneous amount of money, but that would be the major pieces to make up.
But are you doing two things with the property tax on the MFP, or are you by transferring the state share to local share? Does that mean the local property tax owner would be paying more?
Yes.
To support students?
Yeah, so it depends. So the local property tax owner, yes. In the areas with big ITEP contracts, those guys would end up basically funding the schools instead of what they're paying now, and then the rest really wouldn't shift to the residents themselves. But that would really be the big offset. What you would use is the minimum foundation program, basically as a minimum foundation, where you're really redistributing money to the poorest areas of the state in order to support their school system, and letting the richer areas of the state with higher property values using their local property taxes to fund their school systems. Yes, Melinda.
So are you suggesting that in some of the programs that the state, are you suggesting that some of the programs that the state currently funds and runs itself should then be cost shifted to the local? So if they have more increased revenue and the state has less revenue, are the locals going to be running healthcare programs and educational programs and higher education programs and things that the state is doing now? Because if you're shifting the revenue to the locals, wouldn't you need to shift those cost responsibilities to them too?
Yeah, so that's when you reduce the minimum foundation program, I mean, that's really the major piece. There's a few others. So for example, the revenue sharing program is about $90 million, which is basically just an offset for the homestead exemption. So if you get rid of that, that's money that's just directly paid to locals. The inventory tax is, 200, 300 million, depending on whatever year it is. And so that's money that's just directly paid to the locals, that now that will be offset off the state's books because we're not going to pay that credit anymore. That tax will be gone. And then the locals will just raise that money through property taxes. For the minimum foundation program, though, that is the one that is really, you're shifting those, that you're giving them the ability to raise that money in property tax, and actually just doing an automatic offset for that, and then you're making them responsible for that revenue. That's exactly what that is. It's basically a one-for-one shift, and it's mostly the richer areas that would have that. Now they would pick up that responsibility, while the minimum foundation program would basically pay mainly for the poor areas of the state that don't have the tax base that's relative to the others.
Right, but I'm saying, like, you're taking away more money than those pieces of it. So what other programs are you talking about shifting to local responsibility? Because I feel like 4.5 or $5 billion, depending on how you calculate what's income tax, is larger than just the share of ITAP, the $90 million revenue sharing, and the other things that you mentioned. There's a few $1 billion extra in there. So what other responsibilities that the state has are you suggesting the local should take?
Well, you're also, like I said, you're also raising the state sales tax component like 2%, which is going to be about $2 billion. So, I mean, that's also going to make up some portion that the state responsibility is going to be maintained, except it's going to be shifted from state, it's going to be shifted from the income tax to sales tax. And then the portion of the tax that's going to be reduced for the locals, they're going to make that up with property taxes. So it's not really shifting the balance, it's just shifting where it's coming from for the state. It's not complicated at all.
Richard, after this interim study, do you see a bill being prepared for the 2023 regular session that you would hope to be heard and debated, or is it
Yes.
further down the road?
No, yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I can tell you, I mean, we can delay this. We've delayed it forever. I think that at the end of the day, really legislation is how you get people to the table and discuss what the real issues, that's where the rubber hits the road. So I would say bringing the bill in 2023 is the absolute goal. Whether or not I won't be, naively optimistic and say, hey, it's going to pass next year. But I think, honestly, I think that it's a very pertinent campaign issue. I think it's going to be a very pertinent campaign year. And I think that people of Louisiana should have a choice of what kind of future they want. And I think this is an important part of that.
Since
Yes.
you said it would be an important campaign issue, the governor is able to get just a lot easier time getting anything done. Your name's been mentioned as potential gubernatorial candidate in 2023. Would you like to comment?
I haven't made any kind of official announcement or decision, but it's something that I'm definitely looking at and planning for.
All right.
Thank you.
So would you anticipate the locals, since the locals are going to have more property tax revenue, would you also anticipate that they would cut local sales taxes? Because if you're raising state sales tax, that puts combined state and local as an outlier.
Yeah, so there's actually in the Constitution, there's actually a limit of 3% for all local sales tax, right? Unfortunately, that can be overridden by statute, which we have done all over the place, and that's why, it's up to 5.5% or something like that on a local level. And so what my bill did in 2021 was actually put a hard cap of 3% that would phase in over a course of 4 years or so as their other sales taxes expired. And so that way you would actually have a reduction in the sales tax even with the state increase.
And do you see this as more of a kind of an all or nothing situation, or do you think that maybe the study that you initiated would maybe not get all the way to eliminating income tax, but maybe you can accomplish some simplification or some other thing in between your ultimate goal that would maybe be an improvement, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think it can. I think it's difficult because, like I said, it's kind of like a Jenga game, right? Every piece you remove, it makes it fall somewhere else. And that's the difficult section. At the same time, there are offsets that can be done in all of this where, hey, look, maybe we can get rid of the inventory tax, which is really bad and scares away a lot of manufacturers, and maybe we can cut down some of these rates somewhere else so that the locals can fund themselves. And so I think that there's definitely negotiations that can be done around all of it. So it's not necessarily, all or nothing, but it's, like I said, it's very complicated because it's very interwoven.
I know the dominant theme today is tax, the elimination of the income tax. But would you care to comment? You were selected to serve on the Ronald Reagan investigative committee in that situation. Would you care to share your general takeaways from having served and continuing to serve in that investigation. What are your thoughts about what you've seen in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, the Ronald Green, I think it's been as enlightening for the members of the committee as it has been for the state in general. I think it was obviously a terrible incident, and I think having to, sometimes in the legislature they don't prepare you in the flyer about what you're actually going to have to do in the legislature. And honestly, sitting on that committee has been very difficult. I think everybody could probably tell you that. I think it's really exposed a lot of the shortcomings in governments and oversight in the state police. For me, it's kind of bad. I mean, I always held up the state police, at least in my own mind. I always thought they were kind of the exemplar of how being well run and professional, and that was always my impression. And it's really shown that this is not the case here. I think initially when we started that committee, if you're like my wife, you were skeptical that it was going to do anything. My wife was like, I mean, you guys talk about everything in the legislature and you really don't achieve you don't really achieve much. And I think that committee has actually been pretty effective at really exposing, I think, the shortcomings and the problems that existed in state police. It brought a lot of that to light that otherwise would not have happened. And I think it's instituted, it's been a catalyst to really bringing in change and oversight and a much closer examination to how their practices and who's in charge and what they're doing. I wanted us to have more meetings than we've had up till now. We've kind of been on a break. I think we had a lot of momentum going into the summer, and then we kind of broke as a legislature, and it's just difficult to get everybody back together. But I'm hopeful that we'll have another meeting, and I think continue to dig and hopefully come to some even more positive resolution.
Thank you.
Thanks.
What's been the reaction from the sort of the business lobby? Do they seem open to giving up things they like ITEM, in order to get this trade-off that you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the business people as well as for the the citizens of the state in general, I think everybody is kind of on the realization that we have to do something big. To the extent that we can, to the extent that they might have to give something up, everybody's going to have to give something up in order to get this done. But I think what we should focus on is how do you grow the pie, right? I mean, what we've been up till now fighting over is how do we cut up the increasingly shrinking pie instead of growing it. And I think as a business community, I think they recognize more than anyone that really, if you want to be competitive, if you want to attract the best employees, if you want to keep the best graduates, even from LSU or the other universities, if you want to keep them here and hire them for Louisiana companies, you really have to do something innovative and something new. Everybody can read the paper and see. I mean, I joke every time I go to a business lounge anywhere in the country, there's somebody sitting behind me that's talking about how they're moving to Texas because they don't have an income tax. And so I think the business people hear that all the time, and I think they can see that that is a direction that we can go through, the direction we need to head. At the same time, the devil's in the details. I mean, everyone's going to fight to keep their piece of the pie, and that's why we are where we are. But we need to look at it from a standpoint of like, well, how do we grow the pie and not just cut up the increasingly shrinking one. Melinda, I know you had your hand up a couple times.
I'm just curious, how do you propose persuading voters to change the Constitution and give up that homestead exemption, or at least greatly lessen it? That seems to be a critical piece, because you will have to persuade the public that they could give this up.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, honestly, that's all the marbles. I mean, you can pass whatever you want to the legislature. If you can't pass it to the public, it doesn't matter. I would say that bundling it with the elimination of the income tax is what I would say. I think that's the best thing. I think everybody in the state, like I said, has recognized the success of states like Texas and Florida, Tennessee, and I think that's the thing that's been missing in the past is, they've been asked to give up their homestead exemption before. Like, that's been debated many times. But at the end of the day, it's never been there's never been a quid pro quo. There's never had something actually to sweeten that deal. And I think getting rid of the income tax is something everybody hates income taxes. That's why, like I said, Texas has added the entire population of Louisiana in the last 10 years. Everybody generally hates that. Louisiana, we had this historical prejudice against property taxes. But I think if you look at it from a standpoint of you're actually getting something and not just, it's not just a take, it's also a give. I think that that's a much more palatable way of doing it. And that's why in that constitutional amendment that I proposed in 2021, it was all together. It's all packaged. That's right, yeah. Because you can't, otherwise you put it up to the public's going to say, we want to have our cake and eat it too, and that's not feasible. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You also have to do the other things as well. So I packaged it all as a single amendment, and that way you basically vote up or down on the whole package. Yes.
How do you said this, and I was distracted a little bit, but how do you support from Together Baton Rouge or Together Louisiana, and how do they reconcile the fact that maybe they're against the 10-year tax exemption? If that's alleviated, then are they concerned about inordinately about increase in sales tax?
Yeah, I mean, I've been contacted by them as a result of the study because, you know, part of the purpose behind the study was to get input from different groups. I think obviously, you know, they're not big fans of ITEP, so they probably like that piece. At the end of the day, you know, they're probably also not big fans of getting rid of the income tax because they look at that as being regressive. But I think at the end of the day, though, it's something that you're balancing political reality, right? I mean, like I said, if I was emperor, you could go through and you could cut out things or reduce things yourself, but you're going to have to sell it all to the voters. You're going to have to sell it all to the voters. You're going to have to sell it all to the business community, get people on board with it. It has to be something that we as a state actually want to accomplish. And so I think them as a stakeholder, there's pieces that they're going to like and there's pieces they're not going to like. And I think that's going to apply to every individual in the state of Louisiana. There's going to be things that you like and there's going to be things that you don't. But it's let's look 40 years from now. Let's not just look 4 years from now. And if you look 40 years from now, we need these kind of big changes if we're going to be in a place where we can actually compete with these other states. And honestly, we're just not dependent on federal handouts for the rest of our existence. Yes?
Since your plan relies so heavily on shifting to property taxes, does it concern you that every year when we have the reassessment, we come up with a situation where we find out, I found out that my neighbor across the street, his has been on the books for decades
Yes.
at a completely ridiculous level. Is there anything that you could advocate that would make more transparency to that so those type of situations weren't in here? Because after all, the assessor is an elected official and he's going to be responsible for setting, he or she is going to be responsible for setting that valuation upon which any property tax would be based.
Yeah, I mean, I think that by shifting to a system that's more reliant on property taxes, you really have to closely examine the administration of those, right? And I think there's issues with how they're assessed currently. There's issues with how people that when somebody dies or when estates are settled and stuff. There's a lot of property. I'm dealing with this right now in my district. There's a homeowner has a tree that's hanging over his house, and he's trying to figure out who owns this land in the middle of Mandeville, and nobody knows. And apparently the lady died in 1905, and nobody's ever resolved it, right? So they're like, well, does the state own it? Does the city own it? And I think just in talking to like the Realtors Association, this is something that exists throughout the state, is that there's really these unresolved property issues. And so I think when you look at shifting to a more property-intensive model, you really have to look at those things where you need to have some kind of uniform administration of the property taxes. You're going to have a way to resolve a lot of these property issues that really in Louisiana now go on forever. Especially if it's under, for example, if a house is has a $75,000 homestead exemption, doesn't pay any sales or doesn't pay any property tax, like some of those people have been dead forever and it never changes. So it's a big problem, and it really it's not fair from the people that do pay the tax, right? And that's really the fundamental piece, is how do you make it as fair as possible.
If your entire plan, do you envision your entire plan being one piece of legislation that would require 2/3 of votes in each chamber and then go to the voting?
Yeah, I mean, you got to change the Constitution. That's the only way to do it. I think, in the past, people have always said, hey, we want to have a constitutional convention. No, we need a constitutional convention to change all these things. Well, let's change all these big problems that we have in our Constitution. The issue is that, it's once you have that, adds a second complication, because you have the administration of the Constitutional Convention. What are they going to do? Who's it going to be? And so I think that adds another level of uncertainty to people. And then at the end of the day, that will all have to go to the voters too. So there's really not a way. You can't run around. You can't run around the voters in fixing these problems. They're all in the Constitution. You're going to have to address it through the Constitution. Even with a Constitutional Convention, it will have to go to the people to vote. So you can rewrite the articles. You can do very expansive constitutional amendments. And I think then, even before, you won't have the legislature voting on the uncertainty of a convention. You'll have, this is exactly what the bill does. This is exactly what the amendment will do. And then you can go around and sell that to the population. Yes?
Your example of the property in your area, with your example of the property in your area not being uniform, etc., isn't that the exact argument for a state of Louisiana that's smaller than Florida cities, smaller than Texas cities, for a uniform state government? not exploding to all of these entities all over the state? And if we only got $75,000 deduction, isn't the real problem that the houses aren't worth a lot more than $75,000 rather than to shift the tax burden on the poorer people that live in lower valued homes?
I mean, I would say that at the end of the day, the reason people in Texas make a third more than us is they think they have a successful system of government. And so the values of the property will go up if you have businesses that are moving here, if you have people that are staying here instead of moving away. I think that issue with the unclaimed property is exactly kind of this problem between the state and the city that nobody knows who owns it because nobody's ever resolved it. The assessor's office has basically said, well, we don't know who owns it, we're not doing anything about it. And so it's just sat there for 100 years without paying any taxes, and nobody even knows who the owner is. And it's really only come to a head and become an issue because the tree is leaning over this guy's house and he's like, I want to know who I got to call to cut it down.
So I'm paying property tax through my electric bill to West Feliciana, which is next to East Feliciana, and they're getting all of those taxes, industrial taxes. Why don't you fix that instead of worrying about an income tax that's regressive? You mentioned that the sales taxes would go down. I believe there are 50,000 cars per hour on the bridge right here. So if these people are going to stop from Florida and Texas, why should they pay less sales tax and put the burden on people that own properties? Why differentiate? Why blow the state of Louisiana apart? The state of California has 10 million people more than Texas, and they've got institutions like Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA. But you want to use the example of Wyoming and Alaska, which have zero income taxes, and I don't see people moving there left and right. So I don't understand your theory at all.
Well, I mean, I think you can look at Texas. You don't have to go to Alaska. I mean, Alaska is a little bit of a different animal. I mean, Texas is relatively similar to us. I mean, they're really not, they're larger, but 30 or 40 years ago, they weren't significantly larger. And really, it's just the trajectory that they've been on has been one of growth, and ours has just been stagnant. I think that at the end of the day, you know, the idea that we can tax somebody else to pay for our stuff. I don't think you can tax everybody else in order to pay for things in Louisiana. I think that's the fallacy that we've had for 100 years was that, you know, we can tax all the oil companies, or we can tax, you know, honestly, you can tax people that are driving through. And you can to some extent tax, I mean, tourists come here, they spend money, that's fine. But at the end of the day, you're really not eliminating the burden from that, because some tourist comes and stays in a hotel, guess what? That hotel owner pays property tax. So that is going to be passed through to them as well. So I mean, there's really no way to get around it. The question is just, what is a successful way? What is a successful model of attracting people to a state? And the fact that we're right next door to Texas means that we have to look at them for inspiration, because they're the ones we're competing against for basically the same thing. You know, Alaska is a different animal. You know, at the end of the day, people go there for different reasons. But I think you have to look at really what's working. I mean, it's not something I made up. This isn't my bright idea. It's basically looking at these other states that are next to us that have seen this explosive growth and saying, how can we duplicate it here?
Retired from a major oil company and has people working in Louisiana, Texas, and nationwide. I take exception to you saying that Louisiana employees are making 30% less than employees of the same company working in Texas or Florida. That's just not a fact of life. You have to compare when you say salaries. The job in Texas versus the job in Louisiana, and what the comparison is. Just taking a blank 30%, that's not a correct response to the question that we're facing. Jobs in Texas are different than the jobs in Louisiana. But take the same job, I seriously question your 30%.
Yeah, and it's not. Yeah, sure. It's not salaries. It's median family income. And so if you look on the Federal Reserve's website, the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, and they have a breakdown of the median family income by state. And that's really what it's based on. It's based off the national average.
That's because the jobs are different.
Yeah, I agree with you.
The jobs here, you don't have the same issue. We need the jobs.
I agree with you 100%, and that's why I'm trying to get rid of the income tax.
Focus on face-to-face jobs and get jobs in, not as much worried about whether we pay the property as taxes or paying state income tax. We need jobs here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. And the question is, how do you get the jobs there? So historically, what Louisiana has done is we say, hey, come here, we'll give you $20 million for every job you create or whatever. And it's failed miserably. I mean, there was an article yesterday about DXC, about how we told them we'd give them $20 million if they come and blah, blah, blah. And every single one of those deals, as far back as I can remember, has never lived up to its expectations. The truth is, you can't pay companies to come here. What you need is a competitive tax environment. And that's what this whole bill, that's what this whole concept is about, is really exactly what you're talking about. How do you bring the jobs? How do you bring the companies? How do you raise the level of income? It's not, the Chevron employee here and the Chevron employee in Texas, do they make a difference of 33%? No. But just in across the board, the families in Texas make 33% more versus the families in Louisiana. And it's because they don't have access to the jobs and the economic opportunity that they have in other states. But you're exactly right, and I think that's the whole concept, is how do we level that playing field? How do you bring those companies and people here? All right, thank you.